Hello, and welcome to My Favorite Games, a podcast for game designers to geek out about games they like to play. Today, I'm super excited to host Judson Cowan from Tettix Games. Judson is a creative jack of all trades who, in addition to a 20-year career in the design industry, has spent some time composing music for games and commercials, illustrating massive maps and posters, and most recently, moving full-time into board game design and publishing, which is, of course, what I'm keen to dig into today. Judson, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we dig into the game that you've brought today to like the veritable desert island, I know I kind of briefly just teased your journey there, but what was it that made you decide to move into game design full time?
Well, that's a good question. So, I've always kind of been involved in games from like a hobby perspective. Like I grew up playing board games, playing D&D, Hero Quest, all those kind of things that you were weaned on as a kid. I'm big into video games as well. And I kind of got bigger into the board game scene maybe 15, 20 years ago, something like that. Somebody showed me Talisman, and I was like, oh, there were more interesting games out there than I have previously been aware of. Like, having only played Hero Quest and then nothing between then and now that wasn't a Monopoly like. It was kind of eye-opening to me to have this whole world of board games revealed. And like the more I played and the more I discovered, the more interesting I found it. I love learning rule sets and things like that. So when the Kickstarter scene kind of kicked off, like I found it interesting to be supporting these independent creators, basically, where you're enabling someone to create something they find very interesting without having to go through all the red tape of working in like the industry at large. And the more I supported things like that, the more interested I got in making my own. I'd always been involved in the indie video game industry, working with publishers there to like compose music and stuff, and I really enjoyed that community. And I wanted to make my own kind of game, and I wanted to have a lot of control over it as well. So board games felt like a really good opportunity to do that, to create something that gives people joy. That I have a lot of like artistic smithing possibilities on. Like it's an opportunity for me to express a lot of my different creative talents all in one place, which I love. Like I do photography, I do illustration, I do all these systems design, this kind of thinking, and all that's required. And I love how all that comes together in board game design. So that was kind of like why it made sense for me.
Artistic smithing. I like that. It sounds like it completely makes sense. Was there a tipping point when you were like, oh, hey, yeah, this whole thing makes sense. I'm going to go and actually produce my first board game?
That's a good question. So the game we're going to talk about today was one of the ones that inspired me to start designing my first one, which is terrible. So spoilers, the game we're going to be talking about is Trickerion, which is an extremely dense Euro-style game. And so I set about trying to make an extremely dense Euro-style game as my first game. It's still not complete.
Fantastic. Okay, well then with that... tell me about Trickerion. What is it? I mean, the name itself is a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful.
It's a Euro-style strategy game, but describe it. Why do you love it so much?
Yeah, so it's a Euro-style game by a company called Mind Clash, who have a really great track record of producing excellent games. I recently picked up their one of their most recent games, Septima, which is about brewing potions, and that's great. But Trickerion is a game where you are a magician, like a performing magician. And you're competing against the other magicians in this town to learn the best magic tricks and put them into shows and perform them to make kind of like to grow the biggest audience. And the way it weaves the theme together with the mechanics is just fantastic. There's a massive variety as well. It comes with a book of spells that you can, of magic tricks that you can learn. That you have to kind of refer to decide what you're going to learn, what tricks you're going to invest your resources and time into learning, and which shows you're going to put them into. And there's I'm not sure, probably close to 100 different magic tricks you can learn. There's different types of magic tricks. There's like the illusion ones, and there's the escape artist ones, and there's card tricks and all this. And it has like a Victorian quality to it. It's kind of set in this turn of the century world, or like late 1800s world. And the artwork's all fantastic, and it's all unique for every card. So just everything about it screams my name.
What aspect of it made you then think, you know what, this like I want to build more like this? Was it the connection between the mechanics and the narrative and how that gelled, or was it a specific trigger?
That was part of it. One thing that's really important to me in games is a sense of kind of ownership and creativity, to feel like you're able to do what you want with the game instead of just kind of being, I like abstract strategy games I enjoy, but it's kind of like working with the hand you're dealt, and like everybody's working with kind of a level playing field. I like games where you can, like engine builder kind of things, where you can decide how you want to approach it, and they give you a big toolbox of items to do that with. And Trickerion does that really well. Like I said, there's all these different magic tricks you can learn, and you can decide which kind of approach you want to take with it. And every game is unique in that way. So like one game you might have 5 tricks you learn, and the next game you might have 5 entirely different tricks. Or you might do 3 very simple to set up ones, or you might do 1 really complex to set up one. And that sense of player agency is really important to me. And I wanted to try and capture that with a game.
And did you find that like Trickerion, compared to other maybe Euro style games that you've played before, like what about it? What did it do better than other other Euros that you've kind of experienced?
I think that's where the theming comes in, really. Like it's that tying together of the mechanics with a really strong theme, and making it's clear that the theme was considered from the start. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but it feels like it started with a theme and built out from there, and made all the mechanics work in retrospect. At the time, I was also interested in really complex games. I've kind of like tapered my tastes down to kind of mid-weight games now, but at the time I was like, give me as complex as it gets. And there's a lot of moving parts in it, to the point where I think the legendary development thing they did was they made a game, and in play testing, people were like, you need to make this aspect of the game, called the Dark Alley, an add-on component. This needs to be not in the main game. And they did a similar thing with Septima, which I played recently, where like they designed a game and then they removed elements from it because it was too complex. So there's like a simple game you play until you get to learn it, and then you add in this extra component. So I was looking for massive complexity, and it had that, and that kind of called to me. There are other complex games, but it was a combination of that with the theming that really called to me.
So that called to you.
Yeah.
You started working on it, but you haven't launched that one.
Oh, the game that was inspired by it.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So like the game that I started making,
What happened?
It's called Fright House. So the concept there is that you are building and running a haunted house where you like invite guests to come through and you try to scare them, like the correct amount. You want them to leave scared, but you don't want to over scare them and kill them. So you can like kill guests, and you have to then pay a refrigeration fee to keep the cops from coming and shutting down your business. And it's conceptually, I love it, and I've got a lot of the art and design done for it, but it's just like for a first game, it was way too complex. I didn't understand how to create and balance games very well. So I spent a lot of legwork doing things that now I would have to scrap if I came back to it. I will come back to it at some point, but it's kind of on the shelf in hiatus for an indefinite period of time.
It's so interesting. Like I've done several of these interviews now, and that story is actually not it's not unique from like successful high performing game designers. It's like there's this kind of white whale there that they're going to come back to, but they've been able to separate the cool. This is a good idea, but I'm not quite there yet. Let me focus on something else in order to get it, get something else out there, in order to start building, right? My experience. And I guess for you, that was Hideous Abomination. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, it's kind of the classic mastery curve, right? Where there's like the, time versus confidence, like where you start doing something.
Dunning-Kruger.
Yes, exactly. I couldn't remember the names, but it's that. So like Fright House was my like, I'm great at this. I know everything I need to. And then like crash after that being like, oh, okay, I need to simplify things. So yes, that's where Hideous Abomination came from, which is a much, much simpler, lightweight, family-friendly monster builder. And I just put a prototype together in a day. I was like, I need to do something simple. I need to understand how this process works. I need to understand how to publish, how to do a Kickstarter, all those things, and then come back to Fright House. And of course I didn't. I did that one and then I started making something else entirely.
Okay, so digging with Hideous Abomination. So it's a monster builder, more kind of family friendly monster builder. What was the story about how you designed it? Like, how did you? I hear Fright House, Hideous Abomination, obviously your most recent game, which we'll dig into, Deep Regrets. There are some themes going on here, but talk to me through, like, how did Hideous Abomination come to life?
Well, like what I was just talking about, I wanted to do something simple. Like another thing I was doing is I wanted to make a game that was fun to play so that I enjoyed playtesting it. Not that Fright House is not fun. Well, it's not great at the moment. It's too long, and everything I do to make it shorter makes it not fun. So it's like that's where it's struggling. So I was looking to make something that would just be a joy to put on the table, basically. And I like monsters. Like all of my stuff has kind of like a cartoonishly spooky twist on it, which is inspired by watching too much Scooby-Doo growing up or something like that, and Ghostbusters and all these things that kind of shaped my youth. So I put this like prototype together. I didn't originally design it to be a game for families and kids. Like I wanted it to be kind of the exquisite corpse concept, but like accessible by all ages, basically, where anyone could pick it up and play it. It was only over play testing and taking it to market that I realized it was a kid's game, basically. Like it's more complex than the traditional kids games. There's some interesting scoring mechanics there, and that's the part that I was trying to use to separate it from being just a kids game. Is that instead of just making a pretty monster, you have like evolving objectives where over the course of the game, new random objectives will appear, like having the most fingers or the most crotches or whatever ridiculous attribute or body part it is, and people have to adjust their strategy accordingly as the game goes on. And the scoring at the end means counting. There's a lot of like arithmetic involved in scoring, which is a little bit complex for really young kids. So I had to do kind of like, but knowing that it resonated well with a younger audience or with families with kids, I did an adjusted rule set for it as well that like worked for younger audiences that kind of removed all of those complex scoring mechanics from it.
Interesting. Really interesting. And so that one, you designed it in a way that just made you happy to play test it.
Yes.
And that kind of evolved. And you and your mechanics design were kind of informed by that playtesting, or were the mechanics quite set before you started to honestly get that kind of feedback?
They didn't change much from the original prototype. Like it's the current state of it today is remarkably similar to the scribbles I have on a sheet of notebook paper the day I made it. Like there was some nuanced tweaks in the way mechanics, like the way between first and second edition, the way the like end of game objectives are doled out and the way stealing from people works have changed and for the better, but generally it's still the same kind of overarching central vision.
Cool. So now, so you did a second edition of that, and I definitely want to dig into the choice of doing that and doing it on Kickstarter. But now you've just launched your new game, Deep Regrets.
Yes.
And we will link to it, but the teaser video and the Kickstarter video for it is absolutely hilarious. But talk to me about that. Like, how did you come up with that? What's it about? And yeah, what was your approach in terms of the design?
How did I come up with that? So I was heavily inspired by, there was a video game that came out a few years ago called Dredge, which I lifted the genre from. It's like a horror fishing game. It was the first of its type. And I love that. It was not the first of its type. There was a game a few years before that called Sunless Sea, which was similar in tone that I also really enjoyed. These are video games, not board games. And I wanted to do, I was like, I want to do horror fishing in a board game. I really enjoyed that as a video game. And I think that would work, that concept would work really well as a board game. So that was kind of, and I had a game I was already working on that was more about like shells washing up on the beach and collecting them and like having weird things wash up amongst the shells, like feet and things, shells on the beach, but horror. And I was like, you know what? Dredge had it right. It should be a fishing game. So I kind of paid homage to that, but tried to not be derivative and be distinct from it, both in tone and artwork and the styling of it and like the mechanics of the game.
And so what happens?
So it's a horror fishing game, as stated. You spend like a week at sea with a bunch of despondent, angry anglers that have spent their life, alone, drinking, watching the waves roll by, and have regrets that they carry with them. And that comes to life in interesting ways in the game. So the core of it is you're reeling in fish. So there's like 9 piles. You choose one to fish from. You flip it over, and then you try and catch it using what you've rolled for dice for like energy for the day. But as you reveal more and more horrifying things, they will cause you to draw these regret cards, which have a little bit of flavor text on them, like, left my love for the sea, or killed a man, or drank too deep from the well of sadness. So you can build a narrative out of the back of these things. And these affect your madness. So like the more regrets you have, the deeper you fall into madness, which allows you to have access to more dice to catch more fish. And it increases the value of weird fish. But at the end of the game, if you have the most regrets, you kind of lose your most valuable fish. So there's a strong push your luck mechanic at play there. Yeah.
Very interesting. Cool. And in terms of the which informed which, were you thinking about the mechanics first and then having this idea of like dredge in the background and then thinking, it might be appropriate for that, and in terms of a theme to mechanic mix, or did you start off with wanting to do a horror fishing game and then diving down and figuring out what mechanics might work best for each of these kind of instances, or was it another approach?
100% the latter. Like I am very driven by theme, and I think I coming from like a design background, I like working within constraints. I like working to a brief. And I feel like a theme is a constraint, right? Like you have to work within this, like it needs to feel like the theme that you've set, and that sets interesting criteria for constraints. And I think that constraints bring breed the strongest creativity. So treat that as my brief. I want to do a horror fishing game. What makes sense mechanically to answer that and have it feel the way I want to? So it's like setting a brief for myself, which I really enjoy.
Interesting. And so in terms of the differences between the two approaches from a design perspective, what have there been any differences, or were you approaching both the same way?
Well, I've pretty much designed all of Fright House as well, and I'd say in all 3 instances, my process was basically the same. It was like, here's a theme I want to explore that I think would be interesting in the board game space. I might have some vague ideas of how mechanically that would work, and I just sit down and put that together. There's a lot of spreadsheets involved, which aren't very, you know about this, which aren't very romantic, but they're incredibly helpful. And that's like the first kind of week of designing a game is just sitting in a spreadsheet, figuring out what would need to be included and putting together all the numbers, and so that you can then sit down with a Sharpie and some paper and make a really rough prototype to see if it works. And then that's kind of like the process is definitely streamlined the more I've done it. I've learned kind of loopholes and shortcuts to make things happen quicker, and I've gotten better at, but not perfect at, the like waiting to do art until things are a little bit more polished gameplay wise. That's like the classic bit of advice given to game designers is don't do art too early, or don't do art at all and just give it to a publisher as a mechanism. And I am 100% guilty of doing the opposite. It's important in my process that exactly. Like the visual styling of it is equally important to me as the gameplay, and I like to develop them simultaneously. I don't put a lot of money into like producing high quality printed prototypes until the gameplay is there, but I will sit on my computer and say, this is what it should look like, and then here's the Sharpie prototype we're going to play with. Like just to give myself a sense of what it will feel like when I'm actually playing.
I mean, even your word choice is distinct. You know, you're talking about theme, and whereas a lot of folks I talk to talk about narrative, and clearly they're very different things. And so it makes complete sense that it's like, well, there's this vibe that you're creating, and a mechanic needs to suit not only the story that you're trying to tell, but also the vibe that you want to impart. Yeah. So makes sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think theme and narrative are very closely intertwined.
Sure. So in terms of like the process of coming up with that initial theme, do you have a lot of these themes like bubbling away and you're thinking, oh, that might make a good basis for a game? Or is it usually prompted by a specific conversation or watching a specific film or playing a specific game that jumpstarts it? Are there any sources of these that you kind of go back to, these like wells that you might be able to go to?
Oh yeah. I mean, just life in general. Like there's the corporate nonsense of like you get your best ideas in a shower, that kind of concept. But I think you get your best ideas out experiencing things and not necessarily things that are the thing you're designing. So like playing board games may not be the best way to come up with the idea for a board game. It might be a good way to like see, like I learn a lot of mechanics and things like that I want to try and employ in my own games or take have a spin on. But themes and narrative and stuff like that, I think you get more inspiration just from travel and I love traveling places. I love visiting new locations. I love exploring new cultures and all that. I think that's incredibly inspiring. I like consuming other forms of media, like movies and books and video games and all that. I think can be interesting things to pull inspiration from for board games as well. So anything and everything can be inspiring, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So in terms of before we dig into kind of the business side, I know that in the past you've talked and shared about how you've lived with anxiety and depression for a long time. How has your journey into doing this kind of creative smithing full time affected your life? Like how has that impacted both of those things?
I mean, it's had a massive impact on all aspects of my life, really. I've suffered, lived with, I'm not sure what the correct terminology is, but I have depression and have had for a long time, since I was a teenager. Anxiety is relatively new to me since the pandemic. Just the stress of everything going on in the world around 2020 to 2021 overwhelmed me, and my depression evolved into severe depression and then severe anxiety alongside it, and I felt it difficult to even exist a day at a time. I am since no longer at the moment depressed, which is great, and a big part of that is stepping away from the corporate environment. The pandemic was extremely stressful for sure, but just working in an environment that I saw deteriorate over the course of the pandemic was really bad for my mental health. Like I worked for a company that always kind of, I felt had the best interest of its employees at heart. And over the course of the pandemic, that changed because they were struggling to make numbers meet. A lot of people left, a lot of people came in, and the people that came in kind of ran roughshod over those of us that had suffered through a pandemic. And one of the big triggers for me moving into full-time board game design was being made redundant from that. So I was kind of like stripped of responsibility over the course of a year and a half, which just wreaked havoc on my mental health, and then was eventually exited from the business, which sucked over that year and a half, but has, it's one of those things I knew at the moment it happened would be something I looked back on as a positive thing, but was very hard to see. And now I kind of see that, like, that gave me the opportunity and the runway I needed to spin up a business. And the impact that has had on my mental health has been incredible. Like I always kind of, I always had the side hustle. I've always done this like music for video games, illustrations, design, freelance stuff. But I always avoided making that my bread and butter because I am a very social person. I'm the classic extrovert. I get energy from being around other people. And I worried that working 100% in isolation would not be good for mental health. In fact, it's been pretty much the opposite, where I think you kind of fall into these like convenient friendships in a corporate environment where your coworkers become your friends and you spend all your time with them. And some of them might be great, but they're still your colleagues. And I tended to prioritize my relationships with those people rather than seek out perhaps people I might have a deeper connection with. So now I spend a lot more time socializing with my actual friends instead of just, and a lot of those are people I've met in previous workplaces, but they're the ones that mattered, So instead of just hanging out with the people that are at hand, it's choosing to spend time with people that are most important to me. And I find other ways to get out there and like engage with the community. This is the best community to be in for someone who wants to be face-to-face with people. I think by its nature, the board game community is very interested in others because they play board games, and board games require most of the time that you be sitting at a table with someone or online on a video call with someone playing them in modern days. and thus the community is very kind to one another and very engaged and very willing to like sit down and meet new folks and stuff. So it's been great.
Absolutely. It has been great as someone who's just starting off down this journey. It's amazing how people like you are just always happy to chat, even though things, you certainly have a lot better things to do, which is lovely. When you were talking just then about like, you weren't sure about the idea of you always did some side hustles and doing freelance work but that's quite different than then saying, you know what, I'm going to make this into a business. And there are some people that love to make board games on the side, but they're never going to give up their main thing. You made the decision to say, you know what, this is an opportunity for me to actually create a business. So create Tettix Games as its own thing. So walk me through like the thought process of how you plan to do that. You're for example, you decided to self-publish and launch on Kickstarter. What was that decision process like? Why didn't you, for example, pitch it to publishers? Why'd you choose that approach?
So the initial decision to self-publish was born more out of a lack of education more than anything. Like I had engaged with Kickstarters. I had no idea how to the publishing industry is kind of opaque and difficult to understand how to engage with. Whereas Kickstarter, you can do it yourself. And I've always been kind of a, self-starter. So it made sense for me from that perspective. Having learned more about it now, I still think it's the correct decision for me. I think I have the advantage of being my own artist and designer that a lot of board game designers don't. So they will design a game and then take it to a publisher because they don't want to, they don't have the funds to hire an artist or a designer to do the things for them, or they don't want to be involved in that aspect of it. They just want to design and set aside. And I want, I hate, I'm trying to think of a word that's not as douchey as visionary, but like I have a vision for things.
I'm the ideas man.
I'm not a visionary, but I do have a vision for things that I want control over, and being a sole proprietor of a business that self-publishes means I can control every aspect of that from concept to delivery, which means when I come up with a theme, I can choose how that interweaves with the mechanics. I can decide what the art looks like. I can figure out the name. I can do all of these things on my own so that what is produced at the end of the day feels like it actually came from me. Whereas working with a publisher, they tend to get pretty heavily involved in a lot of cases with the theme. They can re-theme things. They can change, like hire a different artist if they don't like your art style, those kind of things. And I wouldn't want to lose control of those aspects. They're very important to me.
Interesting, and I'm sure they are. The importance of that also propels your energy to want to produce the thing in the first place.
Yeah. Making board games is an excuse to draw weird things for me.
Exactly. So your first Kickstarter for Hideous Abomination was successful, and so successful that you did a second one. But aside from obviously the positive aspects of the game and the attractiveness of the game itself, are there other reasons that you think that like fed into its success? Like, were there decisions that you made when you were going on Kickstarter that meant that looking back on it, it set you up for success a little bit more than you maybe realized at the time?
I think my foray into board games has been much more a fail-forward experience. Yes, they were both successful, but the first Kickstarter just barely. Like it literally funded an hour from the end of it, and it was actually help from the community that made that happen. Like I didn't know what I was doing. I set it up. I took shipping costs on Kickstarter instead of using a pledge manager, and someone told me you should use a pledge manager, and encouraged me to allow people to add funds to their back, like the pledge level that they backed at, so that they could use those in the pledge manager later, which yes, I did. I worked with BackerKit on. And that's what got it over the line. Like I didn't think we were going to fund. It was kind of like, it was a very exciting last day because I woke up in the morning being like, well, it was an interesting experience, but it didn't go well. And then miraculously in that last day we did fund, and that was really cool. So it was scraping by. Should not have funded because I did it all wrong. I set my goals too high. I didn't know what I was doing. So that was, more than anything, that was a learning experience. And I took those learnings into the second one. And that was also done during lockdown. Like that Kickstarter ran in July of 2020, which meant that I had to kind of go the last stretch of it without any in-person interaction. It was like there was no in-person play testing and things like that. So I don't feel like the end product there was as good as it could be, which is why I did a second one. I had a partner wanting to take it into the German market, and I had just been made redundant, and I was like, you know what, this is a good way to make some funds to kind of extend my runway. Let's just go ahead and do another Kickstarter. Let's add in German as a language. Let's refine the game a bit and put it back on Kickstarter. And that was more successful. It still didn't do as well as I'd hoped it would. And that was a learning about price points, which is interesting. I never thought I would be a small business owner. Like, I am definitely not a numbers guy, and I still to this day am not, but like I've had to learn so much about like profit margins and basket values and, ad revenue and all these things. So the second one was much more successful and did give me, kind of a salary to work off of for the next year. It wasn't what I had been making, but it was enough to kind of get me to where I am now. And I'm hoping that taking the learnings again forward from that Deep Regrets ticked all the boxes and did everything correctly in terms of community building, in terms of marketing ahead of time, in terms of how I set up the Kickstarter, and that this one will now make it a sustainable enterprise, basically, that I can continue to do indefinitely.
Yeah, continuous iteration, continuous improvement, but hopefully that improvement seems like it's exponential, right? Yeah. I guess that's the hope, and it seems as though so far, seems as though it's going that way. In terms of then making it into a sustainable enterprise, what's next? What are you working on now? Are you going to go back to the Eurogame?
Fright House? Probably not. I hate to say it. Like, a lot of people keep messaging me being like, make Fright House. But I want it to be great because I grew up in the haunt industry, which is the haunt is the term they use in the U.S. When I was a kid, I made haunted houses in my front yard for trick-or-treaters. I got involved with a friend of mine was in the Boy Scouts. We made haunted houses with the Boy Scouts of America. And then I worked at Netherworld in Atlanta, which is one of the top 10 haunts in the U.S. For just one season, which was great. So it's very close to my heart, and I want it to be great. I don't want to put something subpar out. It looks great, but I want it to be a game people will actually enjoy playing. I refuse to put out a subpar product, and I don't know how to get it there. It's going to mean starting over, basically. And I have too many other ideas I want to come to, so we'll see. Maybe I'll come back to that, but I do have another one brewing at the moment about summoning demons. I've got an idea about a Blob game. I love the movie The Blob. Mm-hmm. Specifically the 1984 remake of The Blob. It's a great, or 1980, I forget, the 1980s remake of The Blob. Yeah. It's one of my favorite horror flicks. And I have a concept about you are a blob trying to consume as much of a village as possible before they put enough salt on you to kill you, that kind of thing. So yeah, making more games for sure. But getting this one over the line is the big next step. The design's 99% of the way there. I just got to finalize everything. Figure out who my localizers are. I've got a few people on the hook for that. Figure out what languages I'm going to go into, and then get that all shipped out and figure out distribution, and then on to the next one.
Awesome.
Which is exciting because that means I get to move back into the creative phase.
So you far prefer the creative phase to the kind of marketing business phase, or do you?
I do. I really kind of like all aspects of it to a degree. I don't like shipping. If I could produce video games would be the obvious option to make a game that doesn't require a physical thing to be delivered to someone, because shipping is just a nightmare. And if I guess I could pay someone to help me with shipping, but I'm still trying to do everything. I'm bootstrapping at the moment, so I'm trying to do everything myself to keep costs down.
Do you work on only one game at a time, wait until it's finished, and then move on? Move your attention to the next one, or do you have several going at the same time?
I'm pretty good about this. I know that a lot of people tend to have 15 prototypes going at one time, but I do tend to pick one and stick to it. Obviously, I have 3 floating at the moment where I've got Deep Regrets, I got my next one, I've got Fright House, all kind of in development, but I have been focused on Deep Regrets. My time has not been split between that and other games, really. So I like to get something. I'm a finisher. I guess that's my
shipper
personality type or business personality type or whatever they're called, where I like to get things over the line. I find joy in that aspect of it. And I enjoy the process of the marketing aspect feels like a creative process to me as well, because I get to do these like ridiculous videos for Kickstarter and make all these ads and stuff, which is, my bread and butter. I grew up in the ad industry. So all of these things are fun for me as well.
Awesome. Well, Judson, thank you so much for taking some time to share your experience and geek out a little bit about Trickerion.
Trickerion.
Still can't get that name right. If you'd like to find out more about Tettix Games, you can find them on X and Facebook with the handle Tettix, Tettix, or by going to tettixgames.com. Deep Regrets is live on Kickstarter right now. You can search for it on Kickstarter, or you can look in the description of this podcast episode for the direct link. Judson, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.